alarm is ringing. It won't stop. It's 7 o'clock in the morning inside a small quiet house on Husky Drive in Newfoundland, Canada, and a teenage girl follows the sound down the hallway to her mother's bedroom. She pushes the door open. The bed is empty, but the phone is still there on the nightstand, buzzing and buzzing like it's trying to tell her something. The purse is there, the coat is there. The shoes are lined up right where they always are. The passport is in its place, the car keys haven't moved. Every single thing a woman would reach for, if she were walking out that door on her own free will, every single thing has been left behind. Only Jennifer Hillier Penney is gone. This is the story we are telling today on TrueCrimeWeb. Stay with us. To understand what happened to Jennifer Hillier Penney, you first have to understand who she was and where she came from, because the place that shaped her and the people who loved her are absolutely central to everything that follows. Jennifer grew up in Saint-Lunaire-Griquet, a tiny coastal community perched on Newfoundland's great northern peninsula, one of the most remote, wind-swept, and ruggedly beautiful corners of Canada. It is the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, where the ocean is never far from your front door, and where family is the gravitational center of daily life. Jennifer was one of 7 children raised by her father Alan in the Hillier family household, and by all accounts it was a home defined by closeness, warmth, and love. People who knew the family used those words without hesitation. Public records placed Jennifer's date of birth on the 28th of December, 1977. Those who knew her growing up described her as blonde, green-eyed, and instantly recognizable, in part because of a subtle physical detail that had followed her since childhood. One of her legs was slightly shorter than the other, the result of an illness in her early years that was never publicly identified, and it gave her a gentle, understated limp. But the people who loved her said that after a while, they simply stopped noticing it, because it was just Jennifer. It was just who she was. It was woven into her the same way her laugh was, the same way her warmth was. It was simply part of her. It was in that small coastal town during her high school years that Jennifer met a boy named Dean Penney. He would go on to become her husband, the father of her children, and the defining presence of nearly her entire adult life. Their relationship started young, and it lasted. In the years that followed, the couple moved roughly 20 kilometers away to St. Anthony, a slightly larger regional community with a population of only a few thousand people, where they settled into married life and eventually built a home together on a street called Husky Drive. Over the course of their marriage, they had 2 daughters, Marina and Dina, and for a long time, at least on the surface, life looked the way life is supposed to look in a small town where people look out for one another. Jennifer worked at the local hospital in St. Anthony. Her specific role was never widely publicized, and she wasn't a public figure in any conventional sense. She was simply part of the rhythm of that town. She showed up for her shifts, she checked in on her aging father, she came home to her girls, and the people around her described her in the kind of terms that say everything without saying very much at all. Family-oriented, compassionate, funny, so genuinely well-liked that when investigators later went around asking whether anyone had ever had a problem with Jennifer, not one single person could name an enemy. Not one. Her friend, Gina Elliott, put it as plainly as it could be put. Jennifer would never have abandoned her daughters, and if something had been wrong, she would have called. For most of their marriage, that was the whole picture from the outside. A working mother, a fisherman husband who knew the coastline and the woodlands around Northwest Arm the way most people know their own kitchen, 2 daughters growing up in a tight-knit community. But somewhere beneath that surface, something had been slowly and quietly changing for a very long time. And by 2016, after 18 years together, Jennifer had reached a decision. She had stopped loving Dean Penney, and she wanted out of the marriage. Crucially, she wasn't just thinking about it. She wasn't just talking about it. She was doing something about it, methodically and deliberately, one step at a time. That same year brought another devastating blow. In the autumn of 2016, Jennifer's mother passed away. So at the very moment she was navigating a quiet personal grief, she was also actively separating from her husband. She was consulting a lawyer. She had moved out of the marital home on Husky Drive and gone to stay with her father, Alan, back in Saint-Lunaire-Griquet. She had begun researching jobs in Glovertown, a town significantly closer to where her eldest daughter, Marina, was living, because being near Marina mattered to her deeply. According to people close to her, she had a job interview lined up. She was making concrete plans. She was not drifting. She was building an exit brick by brick with clear intention and clear direction. But as the separation moved forward, something else was building alongside it, something much darker and much more frightening. Friends and family members said that Jennifer had grown genuinely afraid of Dean during this period. He had reportedly begun appearing near her workplace around the time her shifts ended. He was suspicious, according to those close to her, that she was in communication with another man, when in reality much of that communication involved lawyers and the entirely ordinary practical work of ending a marriage. Jennifer's fear became serious enough that she and her closest friends quietly established an informal safety system, regular calls and text messages, a steady and deliberate rhythm of checking in, just so that someone always knew she was all right. It was a small thing, but it tells you a great deal about how the people around her understood the situation she was in. On the 16th of November 2016, exactly 2 weeks before she vanished, Jennifer made a decision that her family would later come to see as one of the most quietly significant things she ever did. She changed the beneficiary on her life insurance policy. She removed Dean's name and replaced it with the names of her 2 daughters. That was where things stood as the final days of November 2016 arrived. Jennifer was working, grieving her mother, visiting her father, planning a future closer to Marina, and trying step by careful step to build a life outside the one she had outgrown. And then came one final ordinary-sounding arrangement that would put her back inside the very house she had been working so hard to leave. Dean had planned several days of duck hunting at a cabin roughly 45 minutes away near Northwest Arm. The couple's younger daughter, Dina, wanted to remain at the Husky Drive house during that time because it was closer to her school. So Jennifer and Dean agreed that while Dean was supposedly away at the cabin, Jennifer would stay overnight at the family home so Dina wouldn't be alone. By all accounts, Jennifer was not enthusiastic about this arrangement. She did not feel safe in that house anymore. But she agreed to it on the clear understanding that Dean would be at the cabin for the entire duration. That seemed like a reasonable boundary. It seemed like it would hold. The 30th of November 2016 was the last day anyone who loved Jennifer Hillier Penney ever saw her. She went to work that day like any other Wednesday. In the evening, she had dinner at her father's house in Saint-Lunaire-Griquet with several family members, including her sister Yvonne. Around 6 o'clock in the evening, she left to drive Yvonne to an appointment at the hospital back in St. Anthony. On that drive, Dean called her. He asked when she would be home. She told him she was on her way. She mentioned she wasn't feeling particularly well. She had a headache, and she said she planned to take a bath or go straight to bed once she got to the house. Around 8 o'clock that evening, Jennifer sent a text message to her daughter Dinah. She said she was home, that she wasn't feeling great, and that she was going to rest. Dina was out with friends that night and didn't get back to the house until sometime after her curfew, around 9:30 or later. When she walked in, she ran into her father, Dean, who told her he had come back from the hunting cabin because he had forgotten his duck decoys in the garage. He left again shortly after that. Dina, worried about getting in trouble for missing curfew, went quietly to her room. Jennifer's bedroom door was closed. Dina didn't open it. She never actually laid eyes on her mother that night. She didn't know it then, but that closed door was the last moment she would ever be in the same building as her. The next morning, the 1st of December, at around 7 o'clock, Jennifer's phone alarm started going off, and it kept going off. Dina went to check, and her mother wasn't there. What she found instead was every sign of a woman who had not chosen to leave. The phone was still ringing on the nightstand. The purse was untouched. The coat and shoes were right where they should be. The passport was where it always was. The car was parked outside with the keys reportedly left in or near it. There was no note. There was no message to anyone. Jennifer had not shown up for work. She had not called her father, her siblings, or a single one of her friends. For a woman who had people actively checking in on her every single day because she was afraid, this silence was not ambiguous. It was immediately and undeniably wrong. Police were called that same day, but in the earliest stage of the investigation, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police approached the situation primarily as a missing person case rather than as a potential crime scene. There were no obvious signs of forced entry. There were no immediately visible signs of a violent struggle. A search dog was brought in and reportedly could not pick up a scent trail leading away from the property, which suggested Jennifer had not simply walked out into the surrounding countryside on her own. Local searches began across roads, wooded areas, and the nearby coastline. It would take until the 7th of December, a full week later, for police to formally classify the case as suspicious and begin treating the Husky Drive property as a potential crime scene. By then, according to Jennifer's family, a significant number of people, friends, relatives, and volunteers had already passed through that house, potentially disturbing whatever physical evidence might have been there. A later forensic examination of the scene reportedly found no clear signs of a violent struggle, and no significant visible blood evidence, which only compounded the difficulty of building a case without more to work with. What followed was a massive, sustained, and community-driven search effort. RCMP officers, Canadian Rangers, search and rescue volunteers, divers, boats, and even a helicopter combed the land and coastal waters in and around St. Anthony. The community of that small town responded with remarkable dedication and love. Local residents raised approximately $22,500 through a bingo fundraiser, specifically to fund sonar searches of the surrounding water. Posters, billboards, and car magnets bearing Jennifer's photograph appeared across the region. Balloon releases and candlelight vigils were held at Fishing Point Park, where people stood in the wind and cold and refused to let her name be forgotten. Dean's mother, Ruby Penney, publicly defended her son throughout this period and offered a reward of $25,000 for information, while also at one point raising suspicion about another local man. Despite the searches, despite the community's tireless effort, despite the national media attention that came when the CBC's investigative program The Fifth Estate ran a two-part feature on the case and highlighted serious inconsistencies in Dean's account, particularly around his story about returning to the house for forgotten decoys, no trace of Jennifer was ever found. Investigators interviewed more than 100 people over the course of the following years. The public message from police remained consistent. The investigation was active. Someone out there likely knew more than they had said. But for 7 long years, no one was arrested. For 7 years, Jennifer's family held vigils, put up new posters when the old ones faded, and kept on saying her name. Behind that public silence, something extraordinary was quietly taking shape inside the RCMP, something that would ultimately become one of the largest and most expensive undercover operations in the entire history of the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. Because investigators understood something clearly. A missing person case with no recovered body, no obvious crime scene, and no physical evidence capable of carrying a prosecution on its own needed something that conventional forensics simply could not provide. It needed a confession. And so in September of 2019, an undercover RCMP officer, using the name Vic, made first contact with Dean Penney, initially posing as someone interested in renting his hunting cabin. That simple, unremarkable first conversation was the opening move in what would become a 4-year undercover operation built around a technique known in Canadian law as a Mr. Big Sting. The strategy works like this. Undercover officers slowly and methodically build a fictional criminal organization around a suspect, offering well-paid work, travel, access to valuable property, and the promise of protection from police trouble, all while carefully and systematically testing whether the target will eventually tell the truth about what they are suspected of having done. Over those 4 years, Dean was gradually pulled deeper into this elaborate fictional world. He was introduced to men who presented themselves as connected, wealthy, and dangerous. He was shown property and taken on travel and given every impression of being welcomed into a sophisticated criminal network operating right across the country. To a man who, by his own later testimony at trial, was struggling financially, it must have looked like a genuine way out of very real problems. A world almost incomprehensibly different from the one he actually lived in on a fishing income in a small Newfoundland town. Roughly 100 RCMP personnel in various roles were involved in the operation by the time it reached its conclusion, and the effort extended over the course of approximately 4 years and 6 separate missions. The operation built steadily toward a climactic meeting with a supposed crime boss named Rudy, and one of the most significant and dramatic encounters in the entire operation took place aboard a yacht in a Vancouver marina on the 30th of November, 2023. That date was not chosen randomly. It was the exact 7th anniversary of Jennifer's disappearance. Dean, believing he was being seriously considered for a lucrative position as a yacht captain within this criminal organization, was confronted during that meeting with a fabricated document suggesting that police were on the verge of arresting him. He was told plainly and directly that the only way the organization could help him was if he told the boss, Rudy, the complete and honest truth about his past. That night, after hours of recorded conversation, Dean Penney gave his first detailed account of what happened to Jennifer on the night of the 30th of November, 2016. He said he had gone into the Husky Drive house to retrieve his duck decoys, that Jennifer woke up during his visit, that the two of them ended up near the stairs by the garage, and that he pushed her, causing her to fall and strike her head. He said he checked for a pulse, believed she was dead, and then described cleaning up the scene, wrapping her body, and concealing it inside a duck decoy bag. He said he deliberately stopped at a gas station later that night, specifically so that surveillance cameras would capture his vehicle and make his drive back toward the cabin appear entirely routine and planned. He then described taking Jennifer out to the water near Northwest Arm and placing her body into the ocean, in an area he estimated to be roughly 80 to 100 feet deep. In a subsequent recorded conversation, his account became significantly worse. Dean told undercover officers that after Jennifer fell and struck her head, he had struck her multiple times with a mallet-like hammer, and he was explicit about his reason for doing so. He said he did it so she would not wake up. That single devastating detail transformed the account from what might have been argued as an accidental fall, followed by a panicked cover-up, into something far more deliberate. It described an intentional act. It described a killing. 2 weeks after that conversation, on the 15th of December 2023, the RCMP arrested Dean Penney near the Deer Lake area. The following day, he was formally charged with the first-degree murder of Jennifer Hillier Penney. Police publicly described the case as one of intimate partner violence, confirmed that Jennifer's remains had still not been found, and said little else as the case moved forward through the justice system. The trial of Dean Penney finally began on the 1st of April, 2026, in the Supreme Court of Newfoundland and Labrador in Corner Brook, before a jury of 12 members of the public. Dean pleaded not guilty. Over the weeks that followed, the Crown built its case methodically around the timeline of the separation, around Jennifer's documented fear of her husband during that period, around his confirmed presence at the Husky Drive house on the night she disappeared, around the belongings she left behind, around the gas station stop he made that night, and at the very center of it all, around the 2 recorded undercover confessions. Those recordings were the backbone of the prosecution's case, and the Crown argued that they were not performances. They were admissions. The defense's primary strategy was to attack those very confessions at their foundation. Dean took the stand in his own defense and told the jury that he had never killed Jennifer, that everything he told the undercover crime boss, Rudy, was completely fabricated, a desperate and calculated performance by a man who was struggling financially and believed that his freedom, and potentially a significant sum of money, depended entirely on giving this supposed criminal organization a story compelling enough to be believed. His lawyers also directed the jury's attention toward another man as a potential alternate suspect, though that man had died before the trial began and was therefore unable to respond to any of the allegations made against him. His family strongly and publicly denied any involvement. The jury also heard from Jennifer's eldest daughter, Marina, who testified that her mother had been making concrete plans to relocate away from St. Anthony and had told her directly that she was afraid of her father. Marina was careful to clarify, however, that she had never personally witnessed physical violence between her parents. A neighbor testified that Dean had made a deeply unsettling comment in the weeks before Jennifer's disappearance, a comment that seemed to suggest Jennifer would simply vanish and her family would be left with nothing. The defense pushed back hard on that testimony, questioning the witness's memory and his credibility. Investigators also described how certain elements of Dean's recorded confession could be cross-referenced against independently verifiable facts, including surveillance footage placing him at a St. Anthony gas station on the night in question, and his own daughter's confirmation that she had seen him at the house that night, details that supported key elements of the route he described. Deliberations stretched across several days. At one point, the jury sent a formal request to Justice Vikas Kalra, asking to re-watch the unedited undercover recordings in their entirety, and also requested clarification on the legal definition of coercion in the context of an undercover operation. Justice Kalra provided that guidance, and deliberations continued. And then on Sunday, the 24th of May, 2026, nearly a decade after Jennifer Hillier Penney walked into a house on Husky Drive and never came back out, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty of first-degree murder. Dean Penney's claim that his confessions were nothing more than a fabricated performance had not been sufficient to create reasonable doubt in the minds of 12 members of that jury. Under Canadian law, a first-degree murder conviction carries a mandatory life sentence, with no possibility of even applying for parole for 25 years. And eligibility to apply for parole after that point is not, in itself, any guarantee of release. As of the recording of this episode, no appeal has been publicly filed. Dean's sentencing hearing has been scheduled for the 11th of September 2026 in Corner Brook, where Jennifer's family is expected to deliver victim impact statements before the court. Her remains have still never been found. Her family is still waiting to bring her home. What makes this case so uniquely difficult from a forensic standpoint is not what investigators found, but what they didn't find. There was no blood evidence at the scene consistent with a violent struggle. No confirmed murder weapon was ever recovered, and after nearly a decade of searching, Jennifer's body has still not been located. Preliminary testing in the garage did raise questions about possible staining, and Jennifer's DNA was reportedly detected there. But Jennifer lived in that house and used that garage regularly, which severely limited the evidentiary weight of that finding in isolation. Conventional physical evidence simply could not carry this prosecution on its own, and that is precisely why the undercover operation became not just a tool in this investigation, but its entire foundation. RCMP teams conducted 6 separate underwater search missions and examined more than 130 locations beneath the surface around the Hare Bay Islands, based directly on the location Dean described in his recorded confession. Every single one of those searches came back empty. The Crown argued to the jury that nearly a decade submerged in cold, deep, and constantly moving Atlantic water could very plausibly explain why nothing was ever recovered. The defense argued the opposite, that those failed searches actively undermined the reliability of the very confession upon which the entire case rested. And that confession sits at the center of one of the most carefully scrutinized legal techniques in all of Canadian criminal law. Under a landmark ruling by the Supreme Court of Canada, any statement obtained through a Mr. Big undercover operation is treated as presumptively unreliable, unless the Crown can demonstrate that it carries genuine evidentiary value and that its probative worth clearly outweighs the very real risk of convicting someone based on a story they may have invented to impress a room full of fake criminals. That is exactly why the jury spent multiple days reviewing those recordings and why they asked the judge to clarify the meaning of coercion before they were prepared to render their verdict. They took those recordings seriously. They took that legal standard seriously. And in the end, they found the confessions to be genuine. Stepping back from the specific facts of this case and looking at the broader pattern, what stands out with painful clarity is that Jennifer's disappearance did not happen randomly or without warning signs that those close to her could see. She disappeared at precisely the moment that research and experience consistently identify as the most dangerous period in any abusive or controlling relationship. The moment of separation. The window of time when a victim is actively leaving or has just left is, statistically and consistently, the period of highest risk for lethal violence. The reason is not complicated. Control that once felt total is suddenly, undeniably slipping away. And for someone who has built their entire sense of power around that control, the prospect of losing it entirely can produce an extreme and devastating response. Every single element of Jennifer's final weeks fits that pattern exactly. The lawyer, the move out of the marital home, the job search near her daughter, the insurance beneficiary change made 14 days before she vanished. The informal safety network she and her friends quietly built because she was genuinely afraid. These were not the actions of a woman who was confused or undecided. They were the actions of a woman who understood her situation clearly and was taking every reasonable step she could think of to protect herself while she found her way out. What ultimately proved insufficient was not Jennifer's judgment or her planning. It was the simple, brutal fact that the margin between her and serious harm was far thinner than any of the people who loved her could have known. And that is one of the most heartbreaking truths in cases like this one. People do everything right, and it still isn't enough, not because they failed, but because the danger was closer and more determined than anyone could fully see in advance. Here is what stays with us at TrueCrimeWeb when we think about Jennifer Hillier Penney. She did not disappear during a moment of confusion or passivity. She disappeared while she was actively, methodically, and deliberately building her way toward freedom. The job interviews, the lawyer, the insurance change 2 weeks before the end. She was not a woman who vanished. She was a woman who was leaving, and she was stopped before she could get there. And what makes it so quietly devastating is how completely ordinary that final night looked from the outside. A husband forgetting his decoys, a daughter tiptoeing to her room so she wouldn't get in trouble for missing curfew. Nobody in that house had any reason to believe it was the last night everything would be normal. It looked like every other night, until it wasn't. If you have ever had that quiet, persistent instinct that someone in your life is not safe, we want you to sit for a moment with how seriously Jennifer's friends and family took that feeling in her. They built a check-in system around her. They paid attention. They showed up. And we want you to know that if someone in your life is in a similar situation, that attention, that showing up, that willingness to take the feeling seriously, it matters more than you may ever fully know. Jennifer's body has still never been found. Her family is still waiting, and they deserve at the very least to have her remembered by name. If this story moved you the way it moved us, please hit that like button right now, leave us a comment below, telling us which part of Jennifer's story stayed with you the most, and make sure you subscribe to TrueCrimeWeb so you never miss a story. We will see you in the next one.